So, Rousseau judges civilized society against the standard of an ideal state before the state as we know it, the political state, emerges. But for Rousseau, there isn't really one fixed state of nature. It's an ever changing, ongoing process. He calls it the state of nature, but there's really nothing static about it. It's not fixed. The state of nature turns into its opposite by degrees, it changes through history. And Rousseau charts that ongoing historical process. Through the course of human history, or prehistory, humans take a series of fateful wrong turns. Man begins in this state of happy, solitary, self sufficient, virtuous freedom, but then gradually, really mostly because populations grow, humans come into contact with each other and gradually they form into groups. And within these groups, they start to cooperate and they start to learn from each other. And that first state of human civilization, where they begin to associate with each other, is still free and virtuous. It's a kind of a golden age. But as they start to learn from each other, they start to compare themselves to each other. And this is where things start to go wrong. They compare themselves to each other and they start to compete for prestige. Rousseau sees the first fateful turn as being the introduction of what he calls amour propre, which means self-love, but Rousseau divides self-love into two different types. There's what he calls amour de soi, which is just our own natural, native self-love that we have in the wish to preserve our own bodies and our enjoyment of the natural world and our enjoyment of life generally. That sort of self-love from the inside out, if you like. But through the coming together of human society, amour de soi becomes amour propre, which is self-love, love from the outside in. We start to love the image of ourselves. We start to love ourselves in seeking the esteem of others. And in that process, we become vain and deceitful. And it's through a series of deceits that human beings are corrupted and civilization becomes a process of degradation. We are conned, if you like, into joining the state. And the first of these great deceits comes with the idea of private property. You're not by nature possessed of anything. We take what we need from nature. But at a certain point, someone decides, through an excess of amour propre, that he decides that he was going to call some piece of land his. Rousseau says, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, "This is mine," and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him who, pulling out the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his kind, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the faults are everyone's and the earth no one's." So from that first great deception that creates private property, there comes relations of mastery and servitude. If someone owns the land, then someone else, in order to get the fruits of the land, has to make himself the servant of the man who owns it. And so we get the first institution of civilized inequality. Men in a state of nature are all equal, but through this confidence trick, there are established relations of domination and subordination. People start to gain control over each other. And with this new inequality and domination and subordination, there comes resentment and enmity. People start to dislike each other and they start to fight. Conflicts arise. And this is a state very like Hobbes' state of nature, but for Rousseau, there's nothing natural about it. It's precisely the artifice of civilization, leading men away from their original natural harmony that creates conflict. And it's from this state of enmity that the second great deception arises. someone decides to make himself ruler of everybody, not just master but king. And he does this by offering what looks like a social contract, but it's a deceptive social contract. If you remember from both Hobbes and Locke, the social contract is not between the sovereign and the people, it's between the people themselves. They say, I give up my right of governing myself to this guy on condition that you do too. But here, it's offered by the wannabe king himself, and it sounds good at first. The wannabe king says, let's unite, said he, to secure the weak from oppression, restrain the ambitious, and secure to every man the possession of what belongs to him. Let us form rules of justice and peace, to which all may be obliged to conform, which shall not accept persons, but may in some sort make amends for the caprice of fortune, by submitting alike the powerful and the weak to the observance of mutual duties. In a word, instead of turning our forces against ourselves, let us collect them into a sovereign power, which may govern us by wise laws. Sounds good. Sounds very social contracty, doesn't it? Sacrifice liberties, create peace. But then Rousseau provides the final killer line. He says, all offered their necks to the yoke meaning the apparatus that chains cattle to a plough and makes them trudge in formation and, restricts their liberties. And this is what he supposes has happened to human beings when they fall for this gambit and become subject to a king. It's not a social contract, it's a social trick, as in a confidence trick. And this is really the beginnings of the state. People are yoked to the service of the king, and together they become powerful and start taking more property for themselves, which leads other populations to do likewise, and together under different kings, and that leads to wars, enmities, and conflicts. This time not simply between individuals, but between states, and this leads to military regimes and despotisms. And that's roughly the civilized world that Rousseau saw around him. He always gave a pass to his native Geneva, which was a fairly democratic republican city-state. But his adopted country, France, with the absolutist reigns of Louis XV and XVI, were just such tyrannies. So that's human history for Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It starts off promisingly, but goes downhill from there.